The Government Accountability Office said that Space Force headquarters should be moved to Huntsville, Alabama.
Yeah, Huntsville scored
President
higher.
Trump said that Space Force Command should be moved to Huntsville, Alabama. And yet somehow the current administration is not moving it there?
So the current administration and the head of Space Force Command, General James Dickinson, wanted Space Force to remain in Colorado. And the reason they're giving is military readiness, because they said it will take at least until 2030 to get a new headquarters stood up in Huntsville. And all of that transition is going to interrupt military readiness during a decade when it's really important for us to not just be ready, but to be actively working against the Chinese threat in space.
This is what drives me crazy, because we have an entire organization answering this question, right? GAO is doing studies, research, analytics. They have multiple people on a team coming to an independent conclusion. What does the Space Force commander have? Like him and a couple of buddies who all sit around and were like, this is really going to impact military readiness. Like, how in the world does he come up with his hardened, like, factual evidence to push back against an entire government organization like the GAO? GAO is bigger than a single DoD entity. Not to mention the fact that the entire life history of Space Force goes back to 2019.
Yeah.
So they're 4 years old.
Right.
The Government Accountability Office, I'm pretty sure, is older than 4 years old. I don't know when they were founded.
Right. So I think there's a number of factors here. So one is it's possible that the GAO was looking just at where would it be the most advantageous to have it, and wasn't considering the transition process and the impact that would have.
Fair.
Right? So it's possible that the GAO study wasn't considering that factor, but the general is. So I think the second is that Alabama's already home to the Army Space and Missile Defense. And because it makes sense to obviously be there, Huntsville has a long history of working with missiles for the space program.
Right.
So there's already something there,
Right.
right? And the third factor is political.
Of course.
And so Alabama has very restrictive abortion laws, and the Department of Defense has its own policy that applies to its service members. And because active duty military members don't have a choice in where they live, right? And so when you're assigned to a base, you're on that base, and there's a set of rules.
Yep.
I mean, that's why there's military police. There's, the JAG Corps, military
UCMJ,
lawyers.
yep.
It all applies specifically to active duty military personnel. And so the DoD has a policy where it will pay for its service members to go out of state for reproductive health issues, to include abortion. And that contradicts, Alabama's political morals, or however you want to name it. And so the Republican senator to Alabama, his name is Senator Tommy Tuberville, on that issue has already been protesting by preventing the promotion of hundreds of military personnel. And so, the Senator Tuberville is basically arguing that the decision to keep Space Force in Colorado is in retaliation for, his protest of the DoD in Alabama.
So because this is really interesting. The question about where to put Space Force is a question that really should be based on long-term strategic benefit to the United States, knowing that space is going to be this evolving region of conflict. And yet the decision of whether it goes to Colorado or stays in Colorado, or whether it goes to Alabama, has become a political question.
Right.
And at the heart of that political question is this question of reproductive rights, which is really interesting considering that the DoD is largely an entity that's backed by conservatives. Conservatives, by and large, want to protect the sanctity of human life.
Right.
And yet the DoD has a policy that makes it so that any service member anywhere can go out of state from where they're stationed in order to receive an abortion, if that's what they choose, if that's part of their reproductive health. So if they were to be stationed in Alabama, State law prevents them from having an abortion.
Correct.
But because they're service members, they have the right to leave the state to get their reproductive health services satisfied.
Right. And
so essentially, Alabama doesn't want to be left out of the opportunity to bring a military base, which makes sense. I mean, a military base is a huge benefit to the economy.
Yeah.
But right now, it's a political issue because Alabama is not being chosen, according to the Biden administration, even though it was chosen by the Trump administration, specifically because of its ties to conservative state law and the difference between the state laws on reproductive health and the DoD laws on reproductive health.
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible that it's a combination of all things, right? You know, it could be military readiness. It could be the political issue, right? And the DoD, you know, the military has an interest, in the same vein of military readiness, has an interest in not having unplanned pregnancies.
It's true.
Among their service members, right? So
the military's, it's in the best interest of the military to keep its single service members single and unattached and with no dependencies.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, it is interesting, and I would love to know more about, you know, what went into. I would love to see a study about military readiness, right? About what does that actually look like how would it actually, the transition actually affect, you know, your ability. And maybe you know more than I do about when bases get moved and command centers get moved. Maybe you're able to speak to that better than I am about, you know, what does interrupt military readiness.
Everything I've ever seen in my military and even our government career, it's all based on long-term financial dependencies, right? Like even when you think about how CIA created two buildings, there's an original headquarters and a new headquarters, right? And they're both in the same physical location, but they're two separate buildings. And then there's outbuildings all over the place.
Yeah.
And the same thing has happened in many different ways. I mean, hell, CIA, I think, is considering whether or not to even stay in Langley or whether to move further into Virginia. And other entities, other government organizations throughout the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan area are all considering the same thing, in part because of the threat that's posed to them by being centered in one geographic location, but second, because of growth. Because as population comes in, property gets more expensive. The cost of living adjustment for everybody who works there has to be adjusted. That costs more money when you can just move them, right? Look at Quantico in Virginia as the headquarters of FBI's training grounds. That's a much cheaper location than Langley, Virginia, or
Downtown
McLean,
DC,
Virginia, or Washington, D.C., right? So there's all these challenges there, and usually it's a financial decision, which I think is what gets me so curious about this decision not to move them to Huntsville. And that's why I'm so suspicious of the political ramifications here, because you've got two different presidents, and giving their own independent opinions, and then you've got, you know, the head of Space Force, who is, of course, reporting to the current commander-in-chief, which is Biden. But then you have this independent entity called GAO also responding, like reporting to Biden, but coming up with a completely different answer. And whether or not, it seems silly that they wouldn't bake in readiness. It seems like they would have consulted with Space Force. They would have had the experience to know that whenever you're going to do anything like that, you've got to consult. So it's just, that's, regardless, I think what's interesting to me is that we are very much at risk of the Chinese outpacing us. And we're in it's a rock and a hard place where we are right now. If we keep it in Colorado, we end up making Colorado a concentration of all space activity.
That's fair.
And we delay our move from ever happening. Because if we are ahead in 2045 or 2043 or whatever the date was, if we are ahead by then, what, are we going to stop then and move headquarters? It's never going to happen. So we end up falling behind the perpetual curve, right? Always being on the backside of the wave if we don't move now. If we do move now, we run a risk of not having the ROI after the move. It just seems ridiculous to me that in the best military in the world, we can't do two things at once.